in parts like to work with like part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4, and ultimately part 5. And after it's over, I'm going to do basically a series review. Ultimately, what I thought of the series as a whole. The story is of the Elric brothers, Edward and Alphonse Elric. They study alchemy at a young age, and ultimately they have a mother who they love and adore, and basically that's it. They love and adore her, and she ultimately encourages them to basically, well, they were already practicing alchemy, but basically what she said to them, basically saying how they were good at it, she basically inspired them to continue doing it. They have a father, Hohenheim, von Hohenheim, but he walked out on them for reasons that I don't know as of yet, and this causes Ed to resent him. But ultimately what happens to their mother is there's an epidemic that sweeps through, and she catches it, and she becomes ill and she dies. And basically, in Fullmetal Alchemist, there's a taboo. Basically, you can't create something out of nothing. You can't turn inorganic. Well, that's the main taboo. Basically, you can't basically bring people back from the dead because it works in the law. It's known as the law of equivalent exchange. If you want to create something of equal value must be sacrificed. So what exactly equals the value of a human soul? That's why it's forbidden. But after their mother dies, Ed's like, we can bring her back, and Alphonse like, but I thought, the books we read, basically, you're not allowed to do that ever. But Ed's like, we can do it, but ultimately they gain help from a teacher. Basically, she teaches them everything they need to know about alchemy, about transmutation, because that's what it is. It's transmutation. It's transmuting something into something else. But ultimately, they train for years. They do it for, I think they said 2 years. But ultimately, what happens is they decide, they gather the proper ingredients that would basically you would find in a human adult, and the final ingredient they include is some of their blood to basically act as the soul. But ultimately, what happens is, at first the transmutation appears to be working, but it actually, considering it's forbidden, they pay a hefty price. Ed loses his leg, and Alphonse loses his entire body. But in the process of losing his leg, Ed goes into this different plane of existence, and he meets the Truth, which is the god of the Fullmetal Alchemist universe. And ultimately, the Truth shoves him through a door, and Ed says in that moment he basically knew everything there was to know. He knew everything, and he says like, because at this point, because according to normal alchemists, human transmutation is just human transmutation is just a theory. Basically, it's just a theory what they did. But no, considering Ed saw it, he said it can be done. He just needs to see it one more time. And he asked Truth, like, you have to. He says like, Truth, you need to show me again. I needed to see it one more time. And Truth says, no, I can't do that. You paid the price already. And like, he's like, what? And then it shows basically the Truth appears as a completely white being. And ultimately, what happens after he says that, his Ed's leg is actually put on Truth's body, and then Ed is basically brought back into the physical, human plane of existence. And ultimately, what he does in order to save his baby brother, because Alphonse lost his body, he sacrifices his arm, and he bonds his soul to a suit of armor using a blood seal from his own blood. And ultimately, they have a childhood friend named Winry, and she lives with her grandmother. And Edward now call her Granny because they're really close to her, and she actually considers them her own grandsons. But ultimately, what happens is she comes to basically check out and see what they're doing, and she actually discovers that basically what they did, and she takes them home. And her and Winry and Granny are mechanics, and they say they make a metal arm for Edward and a metal leg for him. And ultimately, what happens is after this, they're actually, when they're able to walk again, they're able to move around. They actually they go back and burn down their house. It's used basically as to say a way to, like, basically we have no reason to come back. Well, not necessarily we don't have no reason to come back, but we have no reason to not move forward. And they're actually approached by two government officials, Colonel Roy Mustang and Lieutenant Rize Hawkeye. And basically, Mustang says, like, if you become a state alchemist, you'll have access to certain materials, privileges, basically stuff that you wouldn't have access to normally. But if you come with us, because he's not trying to basically convince them to come with them. It's completely up to them. That's one thing they make abundantly clear in this anime. The anime, as far as I can tell, is we all make choices and we all must face the consequences of our actions. It's no one's fault but our own for our own choices. We make our own choices and we must face the consequences of those actions. It is no one's fault but our own. It's Edward's fault. It's Edward's fault for what happened to him and his brother, and he accepts that and he blames himself, which is it's harsh, but it's entirely his fault. But ultimately they do agree to go with Mustang and Hawkeye, and they become state alchemist, or at least Edward does. Alphonse doesn't. But anyway, what happens is the first time you see them in action as, like, basically state alchemists is they're chasing this guy down known as the Chiller Alchemist, and what happens is the reason this guy is doing what he's doing is because he wants to go after the current leader of the country, King Führer Bradley. And Bradley is, like, apparently, because you find out this is actually true. What happened is, like, the state alchemists, several of them, including Mustang himself, were actually used as living weapons, because what happened was there was a civil war with a group of people known as the Ishvalans. And what happened was the reason it started is because a soldier actually shot an Ishvalan child. And this ultimately what the state alchemists would do. They were sent there as living weapons to basically take care of it. But ultimately they committed an Ishvalan genocide. But the Chiller Alchemist ultimately decides, like, hey, like, well, I'm gonna take out Bradley because he's the one that made us do all that, the sick bastard. But he ultimately confronts Bradley, but Bradley kills him himself. So what happens after that? Edward and Alphonse they go to a they know of in Fullmetal Alchemist. There's special items that you can use to augment your capabilities in alchemy, basically to do things in alchemy that you normally wouldn't be able to do. You'll basically be given access to powers that you wouldn't have normally. But they go to this town and they meet this. They learn of this priest, and he sells himself as a god because apparently he's able to perform miracles. Apparently, according to the people, apparently even going far as to raise the dead. But Edward and Alphonse see his quote unquote miracles in action, and he's actually really it's impressive what he can do, because, like, he's able to turn. Basically, this is where you learn that you can't turn organic matter into inorganic matter, or vice versa. Basically, but ultimately, I now find out that the reason he's able to do such amazing things because he actually has it's called a Philosopher's Stone. It's one of the items that basically allow you to augment your alchemic capabilities. But what happens is they ultimately confront him, and they try to fight him, and they ultimately have to run away because they just run off. But, like, ultimately they come up with a plan. Alphonse creates a megaphone, and Edward has a switch to it, and basically it's on, and he confronts the guy, and he asks, like, what's your game here, man? What are you planning to accomplish? And the guy points out, like, well, I hope to create an army of loyal followers that will actually die for me, and give it a couple of years, and I'll unleash them upon the world to do God knows what. But ultimately, this is actually, considering it's being broadcasted over essentially a PA system. Everyone in the town hears it, and this actually causes him to basically be exposed for what he truly is. But ultimately, the guy tries to kill Edward, but Edward beats him, and they discover that the Philosopher's Stone that he was using, which was embedded in his ring, was actually a fake. But they leave the town, and like the false god is actually attacked by a being known as being known as Lust. She's actually a homunculi, and he's killed by her. But ultimately, just to sidetrack for a second, ultimately it cuts back to this guy, or not this guy because it's not actually him, but a being actually is able to shapeshift into him, a being known as Envy. He shapeshifts into him and says like, hey, he starts spewing out the same stuff the original guy was, and basically considering he was exposed for what he truly was. Half of them don't believe what he says, but another half of them don't believe it, and the other half believe it. So ultimately, what happens is basically a skirmish between the people, and ultimately, the homunculi caused this. Envy caused it, and gluttony's actually there's a being known. There's envy, gluttony, and lust, and gluttony actually asks says like, well, can I eat them after it's all over? And yeah, but ultimately what happens after that is like Mustang basically in order to basically reward them for doing such a good job, he says like, I'm gonna put you in touch. I'm gonna let you meet a guy known as the Sowing Life Alchemist. Maybe he can like help you. Maybe he can help you get your bodies back, because look at what he's known for. Because he's known as the life sowing alchemist, because or the Sowing Life Alchemist, because he actually created a chimera. A chimera is basically two beings of, I think, of a different species fused together through alchemy. And ultimately, he was able to create a chimera that could understand human speech and it could actually talk. But according to Mustang, the only words it actually said were, "I want to die." And this was two years prior to the series. So yeah. But ultimately, it got its wish because it wouldn't eat or drink anything, and it just basically just died. But Ed and Al meet Shao Tucker and his daughter Nina Tucker and her dog Alexander. And they go into and learn about his research, and as they leave for the day, one of the officers one of the officers points out like, hey, Mr. Tucker, Colonel Mustang wanted to say something to you, like you basically it's almost time to in order to become a state alchemist, you have to basically do something that wows the government, and they'll certify you as a state alchemist, and that's what the guard essentially tells him, like, hey dude, it's almost time for you to give us something. So Tucker, in his desperation, in order to keep his state certification, in order to remain a state alchemist, he creates a chimera, but the chimera, the things he uses, the beings he uses are Nina, who is a little girl, a child, and her dog, Alexander. Ultimately, when Ed and Al find this out, they're rightfully disgusted and pissed, and Edward's gonna beat the ever-loving shit out of them. But while this is happening, Tucker points out like, hey, we're the same, dude. Like, we did something that we knew was forbidden and wrong. We knew it was wrong. We knew it was forbidden. We knew how messed up it was, and yet we still tried it. We didn't care about the consequences of our actions. We still did it. And as hard as Edward tries to deny this, it's true. But after that, Nina basically still, after everything that he's done to her, Nina still is loyal to her father. She still loves her dad, and but ultimately, that's like one of the main reasons as to why Edward won't kill him. Also, Alphonse stops him. But what happens is Tucker is taken into military custody, and he's actually approached by a guy known as Scar, who's actually an Ishvalan survivor. And Scar's main deal is like he wants to take revenge on not State Alchemist as like basically State Alchemist as a singular entity. It doesn't matter if you're involved in the Ishvalan genocide. Basically, all State Alchemists are guilty. Basically, everyone who's a State Alchemist should be punished. So ultimately, what he does is he kills Tucker, and he gives Nina a mercy killing because Nina at this point, as in her Chimera state, she has her hair, she has her voice, she's basically Nina, but the thing is, she's not in her body. Basically, she has Alexander's body type. She has the body of a dog, the full body of a dog. So basically, Scar's like, you poor creature, once you're in this form, there's no way to change you back. So he gives her a mercy killing. It's better than living in an existence like Nina was at that point. But after this, Edward and Al, they look into oh yeah, after this, they're actually confronted by Scar, and he damages them really badly. But they nearly die, or Edward at least nearly dies. But they're actually saved by Hawkeye, Mustang, another guy named Major Armstrong, who's really buff and just pretty awesome. But the thing is, they're saved, and ultimately what happens is Scar runs away and hides in the sewers. But during the fight, Edward loses his arm, and and Alphonse loses basically his armor is badly damaged. But what happens is they have to go to Winry, and they're accompanied by Major Armstrong. And on their travels, they reach their destination. They actually come in contact with a former State Alchemist who's actually a doctor now. And you learn that he actually was involved in research in Philosopher's Stones. And what happens is Ed's like, hey, could I look at your notes? And he's like, no, you can't. But he ultimately goes against that, and he gives Ed basically the location of where his notes are. But they continue to go towards Winry and Granny, basically to get their repairs they need. And the doctor is actually killed by Lust. But they go meet with Winry, and they go. This is where you learn that ultimately what happened to their house. They actually burnt it down. Yeah, that's pretty much it. That's really all that happens while they're gone. So they go back to Central, which is where mainly it's like they go back to their actual where most State Alchemists live. But they actually they go to the Central Library, which is where the doctor told them to go, and they discovered that it was actually burnt down by Lust. And before they got back into town, Scar was actually attacked by Gluttony and Lust, and apparently he was killed because there was a massive explosion, and when the military goes to investigate, they can't find his body. So they assume he's dead, but he's not. He's actually not dead. What happened was he was found in the sewers by a fellow Ishvalan survivor and taken basically to a settlement to basically heal up. But Edward and Al, they go to the library, and it's actually burnt down. It was burnt down by Lust, and her reason saying well, we can't really have them looking into that. But they discover that they have there's actually a worker there named Cheska, and she has an eidetic memory, so she has she knows basically, she documented all of the information she gathered in the library in perfect detail, and they find the notes, but according to basically according to Ed, to the just average person, it would seem like it would seem like cookbook ingredients. Like, it would seem like an average cookbook, but like it's actually encoded messages. But they spend 10 days researching it, and they discovered that you can create a Philosopher's Stone. It's entirely possible, but in order to the main ingredient in order to create one is like human lives. And they discovered that where the doctor was originally stationed, he was stationed at a place known as the Fifth Laboratory. And they discovered that the Fifth Laboratory is actually right next to a prison. So, in order, what's the best place to have for a what's the best place to have like research done on something that requires human lives? Basically a living slaughterhouse. So, despite being told by Armstrong basically to not go there, don't go there, don't go there, they go there anyway, and they actually the main thing about this is actually something to bring up. When Ed's really small, he's a really tiny guy, and he hates when everyone talks down, like brings it up. He's like, don't call me short, I'm not little. But this is actually really advantageous because they can't get inside, or at least they could get inside, but they don't want to bring attention to themselves. So they can't create their own way in using alchemy because they would see, because there's a guard guarding the place, so they would see the light from the transmutation. But what happens is there's a vent on the side of the building which Ed actually crawls into because he's so small. So Alphonse has to wait outside. But while waiting outside, Alphonse is actually attacked by a serial killer known as Barry the Chopper. And the Chopper, Barry the Chopper, was actually, he's like Alphonse. He's like he's a soul bonded to a suit of armor. And Edward goes inside, and he comes across a guy named Slicer. Slicer's also a killer. But ultimately, Edward's arm. It's like while they're fighting, Edward figures out that there's something not right with his arm, and he thinks it's because of like when Winry repaired his arm. She said that there were modifications, but there were also drawbacks to it. Basically, it would be stronger, it would be faster, but it would also be weaker, really. So you sacrifice speed for power, really. But the thing is, Ed's like, he's like, I need you to answer my questions. I need you to tell me about the Philosopher's Stone. What happened here? And Slicer says, like, well, no, I can't tell you that, kid. It's not my place. But ultimately, Ed beats Slicer, and like you find out that Slicer isn't just one guy inside, because he's like Chopper and Alphonse. He's a soul bonded to a suit of armor, but Slicer's actually the head of the armor, and his brother is the upper body of the armor. Because it's a pair of brothers. But ultimately, after defeating them, Slicer says, like, all right, kid, I'll tell you everything I'll tell you everything I know, and I'll tell you everything I know. And ultimately, what happens is Envy and Lust show up, and they kill Slicer and his brother before they're able to divulge any information. And they don't kill Ed. Like, basically, they say they need him for something. And basically, Ed tries to fight back because during his fight with Slicer, it was a really close fight. Edward got the shit beat out of him. But he tries to fight back, but his arm actually malfunctions again. And what happens is outside, because Alphonse is actually fighting Chopper, Barry the Chopper. And Barry actually plants seeds of doubts into Alphonse's mind, saying like, hey, like, how do you know you're real? How do you know you were even like, before you got this body, how do you know you were even a real person? How do you know that you weren't a puppet just created by your so-called brother? How do you know that the memories you have aren't just fabrications? How do you know that the people how do you know that Granny and Winry, how do you know that they weren't in on it? How do you know they weren't in on the sick joke? And this actually is like these words actually are have a deeper impact, because before they went to the Fifth Laboratory, Ed said he was going to tell Alphonse something. He's like, there's something I need to tell you, Al. But like, they were interrupted by Armstrong. And this basically, like, Al reached the conclusion, well, he was going to tell me that I'm a puppet, that he never was my brother. And ultimately, Barry says like the reason he's able to tell that he was real because like Alphonse is like, well, how do you know you were real, huh? But Barry says like, because the guard that was actually guarding the 5th laboratory is just now noticing that there are people there. But he's like, hey, stop, and like Barry throws a knife into his head, and he's like, that's how I know I'm real. As long as I keep killing, it proves my existence. Kind of like, I'm kind of getting like a Gaara vibe from Barry's way of thinking. Gaara from Naruto. But anyway, inside, Envy and Lust beat the shit out of Ed. Or they don't beat the shit out of him. He basically, Envy like hits him like a couple times and he passes out. And they say, Lust tells him to basically burn the place down, basically destroy the lab, so no one can basically come and snooping around anymore. Because, yeah. But ultimately, Edward wakes up in the hospital and he discovers, well, his arm's still malfunctioning, so he gets in touch with Winry, and he says like, "Hey, my arm's broken again. Could you repair it for me?" And ultimately, Ed like thinks like the reason it malfunctioned at all is because of what Winry did to it, basically sacrificing speed for power, and basically she somehow not necessarily messed. She didn't intentionally mess it up, but she somehow did something that caused it to malfunction. And ultimately, Ed's right to an extent because Winry. It's revealed that the reason why it malfunctioned at all is because Winry forgot to put a screw in it. But this didn't necessarily save Ed's life, but it saved him a lot. It saved him a lot of pain because Envy, like when Ed tried to when Ed tried to fight them, when Ed tried to fight Envy and Lust, he went to go do his transmutation, and his arm malfunctioned, and like Envy's like, "Oh, you're lucky that your arm was broken, kid." And I mean, Envy and Lust wouldn't have killed him. They would have Envy would have most likely beaten the shit out of him a lot more than what he originally was, but still. But Winry like ultimately reached the conclusion that she forgot to put the screw into the arm. That's why it malfunctioned at all. But ultimately what happens is Alphonse actually snaps, and like he basically snaps at Ed and says like, "How do I know that you were going to tell me that I wasn't real, right? That I'm just a puppet for you. I'm just a puppet created by you. The memories I don't have are real. You, Winry, Granny, you're all in on it." And he's like, because I remember what you said you were wanting to talk to me about. But ultimately, it's revealed that like what Edward was actually going to say was like, because before like while he was being operated on by Winry and Granny, he actually he's like what if Al hates me? What if he hates me forever for what I did to him? He can't talk, he can't speak, or no, he can't eat, he can't sleep, he can't feel anything while he's in this body. What if he hates me for this? And Granny points out like, well, he's your brother, he would never resent you for that. That's ultimately what Winry reveals to him, and she tells him, because this causes Ed to basically storm off, and he actually goes to the hospital roof, and they basically what happens is Alphonse goes to look for him, and like ultimately Ed actually turns this into a sparring match. And it's interesting to note here because Ed actually wins, which he never succeeded in doing before. But the way he wins, like there's a sheet on the roof, and Ed uses this as like basically as a distraction, and this ultimately causes him to be able to win. And Alphonse is like, "That was a dirty move, brother. That's not a win." He's like, "There's no fair. There's no fair in a fight. Basically, you basically win or you lose. Essentially, that's essentially what he was saying. You win or you lose." But ultimately, they decide to head to a town called. They ultimately decide to head to a town called Dovlov. I think I said that right. But like, what happens is Winry wants to accompany them because on their way to Dovlov, they're going to pass through a town of basically mechanics, which is a mechanic heaven essentially, which is what Winry wants to go with them for. But they arrive there, and each state alchemist has a metal watch that they're given, or no, not a silver watch that they're given, and it's actually stolen by a pickpocket. And they follow the pickpocket all the way to her home in the mountains, and she actually robs. She makes a habit of robbing tourists, and they follow her to her home in the mountains, and it's revealed that she's like Ed, and she has artificial legs, and you find out that she actually lost them in a train crash. But when they get to this house, Winry asks the mechanic like, "Hey, could I be your apprentice?" And he's like, "No." But ultimately, the house is also inhabited by a pregnant woman and her husband, and the baby needs to be delivered, and it's raining outside. So this is later that night, but it's raining outside. So the mechanic goes to leave. He leaves to go get the doctor, and considering the baby's coming, Winry ultimately is the one that delivers it because the doctor can't get there in time. But ultimately, Ed uses this like as a way to like say like, hey, since Winry delivered your grandchild, could you maybe she could be your apprentice, huh? And like he's like, no, I'm still not gonna make you my apprentice, but I can point you in the direction of someone who you can actually apprentice under. And ultimately, while all this is happening, a character known as Maes Hughes, who's actually really good friends with the Elric brothers and is actually Mustang's best friend, he's actually looking into the Philosopher's Stone. He's looking into it, and Envy figures it out, and ultimately, they were told before they left the hospital, and they were told before they were going to Dublin, is because they were told by Fuhrer Bradley himself that the military ranks were infiltrated. They don't know how much, they don't know how deep they've been infiltrated, but don't trust anybody. So Hughes is on his way to tell Mustang, and he's in a secure area, but he still doesn't trust it. So he walks outside to a phone booth, and he discovered he's going to call Mustang and tell him what he found, because he discovered something about the Philosopher's Stone. Well, no, just he discovered something, yeah. But ultimately, Envy kills him, and the thing about Hughes is he has a wife and daughter that he constantly talks about, and he dotes on them, he loves them, he spoils his daughter rotten, and he loves them unconditionally. But the thing is, Envy basically there was a photo of his wife and his daughter, and it was a family photo, but it was a photo, yeah. It was a family photo of him, his wife, and his daughter in his pocket. It fell out, and Envy sees it, and Envy takes takes on the form of Hughes' wife, and considering Hughes would never harm his wife in any fashion, he doesn't strike, which ultimately leads not necessarily doesn't. This ultimately leads to his death. He would never strike his wife, and even if he tried to fight back, he wouldn't have won. He would have. Because at this point, because before he went outside, he was actually attacked by lust, and he was already bleeding out. So, he was attacked by lust, basically, and he got away. He threw a knife into her head, and he got away, but she stabbed him. But ultimately, Hughes dies while the Elric brothers are gone, so they don't know about his death. And they after the baby's delivered and Winry's left it, they leave Winry in the town of the mechanics, basically so she can work as an apprentice for the mechanic she was sent to. But ultimately, they come across their teacher. She's the woman who basically taught them everything they know about alchemy, and basically she taught them how to fight. And what she does is an example of tough love, because when she meets them again, she actually challenges. She goes she's like, "Oh, Al, it's nice to see you again," and he goes to shake her hand, and she actually flips him over. But ultimately, it's revealed she's actually deathly ill, and the reason she's ill is because she actually committed the taboo herself. Basically, her and her husband believed. Her name is Asumi. She believed, her and her husband believed she was actually barren. They couldn't have kids, and they were proven wrong. They were going to have a child, but she became sick, and the baby by extension became sick, and she wanted to bring the baby back to life because it died, and she committed the taboo, and for the price she paid, she lost part of her internal organs, which is why she constantly coughs up blood. Yeah, that's really messed up. But ultimately, they go there to basically try and figure out if she knows anything about the Philosopher's Stone, which she doesn't, because according to her, it never interested her, so she doesn't know. And after learning that they committed the taboo the same as she did, she says, like, basically, I won't teach you anymore. But even though they see this as a loss, her husband says, like, you guys are idiots. Don't spend too much time pouting. You fail to realize what you've gained. Now that she's not your teacher anymore, you can speak to her as equals. And they're like, oh right. And so they go back and they want to question to her, basically if about their bodies. And she says she actually learned, she actually saw truth as well. And that's the reason why her and Ed are able to perform transmutation without a transmutation circle. In Fullmetal Alchemist, you need a transmutation circle in order to perform alchemy. You can't do it by yourself. But Ed and Isumi are special cases because they saw truth. But they summarize basically like since Alphonse since Ed, the reason they didn't get it like the reason they learned so little is when they met truth is because the reason they learned so little and they had such a small opportunity, a small window to learn everything they needed to learn, is because they lost so much. But Al lost his entire body, his entire physical being. So maybe he had more time with truth, maybe. So, but the thing is, Al doesn't remember his time with truth. He doesn't remember it. Asumi summarizes well. It's the shock. It's the shock of what happened. That's why you don't remember anything. But the conversation is actually listened in on by a chimera, and actually fully like a chimera who's actually successful, who isn't like a chimera. He has a human body, but he also has the body. He also has the body parts of an animal. Basically he goes back to his boss, Greed, and they ultimately send him. They send Alphonse a note, basically saying, "We know your secret, and the fact that like we know that you were you. We know that you can transmute souls into suits of armor. We know that you can transmute souls." But ultimately, what happens is it's like a group of chimera. They abduct Alphonse, and basically he comes face to face with Greed, who's a homunculi. The homunculi artificially created humans through the use of alchemy. According to Greed, he's not immortal, but he's extremely difficult to kill. And he, by his own admittance, he's over 200 years old. But Greed wants to know exactly how to bond a soul to a suit of armor, basically, because according to him, it's basically the best thing you could have. Basically, you don't need to eat, you don't need to sleep, you don't even need to use the toilet. But ultimately, what happens is Edward ultimately finds them, and he discovers he confronts Greed. He says no, you have no idea the hell he had to go through since he got this body, so you don't know anything. But ultimately, what happens is Ed and Greed fight, and the other chimera actually haul Al off to basically they want to take him apart. And what they do is Ed and Greed fight, and Greed actually has this technique known as the Ultimate Shield. The Ultimate Shield is basically invulnerable, but there are drawbacks to it. Again, Greed isn't invulnerable; he can be damaged, but he has high regenerative capabilities. Basically, in order to demonstrate this, one of the chimera, who's actually half human, half cow, actually smashes Greed's head and basically he regenerates. But the thing is, Greed's ultimate shield is basically invulnerable, but there are ways around it. There are certain drawbacks. Basically, Greed can't regenerate while he's armoring up. And there's another weakness. Ed actually finds it rather quickly. He discovers what the armor is made of. He discovers that the armor is comprised of carbon, and that basically he says he says you shouldn't have told me that you were human, because what's the human body comprised of? Carbon. So after that, it was a matter of simple alchemy. He was able to counteract the effects of the ultimate shield. And while this is happening, ultimately what happens is Asumi ultimately steps into the fight, and steps in on the fight and basically saves Ed, because even though Ed had discovered basically how to counteract Greed's ultimate shield, it wasn't really that close of a fight. He was still badly damaged, while Greed simply can go on forever, essentially. Because, again, his regenerative capabilities. But, that's the end of part 1, really. Oh yeah, another thing to bring up is, like, when Asumi finds out that Ed and Al created the taboo, Ed and Al actually basically beg for her forgiveness. She's like, we're sorry, please forgive us. And they're actually crying, and she tells them that it's okay to hurt. And they ultimately, they break down and they start crying. But, that's my thoughts on the part 1. I do like it, I do enjoy it, but, the thing, like, just, a major thing about part 1 is that Hughes dies. And Hughes is a really great guy, but, a lot of people, like, the way I see it, the reason a lot of people see his death is so shocking isn't because of the death itself. It's mainly, like, basically what the death proves. It proved ultimately that basically no one was safe. Anybody could die at any point because Hughes was a main character. He was a mainstay. It is basically, since he dies, that ultimately shows that anyone is fair game. Anybody can die. No one's safe. Anybody can die at any time. And that's how it is. But I'm not necessarily saddened by Hughes' death. Yes, his death is sad, but I'm nowhere near as broken up as a majority of other people are. His death is sad. He was a really great guy, yes. But the way I see it, how many times in any other form of media, games, movies, TV show, anime, books, have we had the family man who's also a soldier, who constantly brings them up, who basically constantly talks about them like, oh, I have a girl back home, or I have a family back home that I can't wait to see. How many times have we had characters like that just to have them die? How many times? Insurmountable. But no, that's the reason I'm not as saddened as the reason I'm not as saddened by Hughes' death as most people are is because I see, basically, I realize it's ultimately a cliche. The family man who's also a soldier will ultimately bite the dust. The reason so many people are so broken up about it is because, yes, his death was sad, but ultimately it proved that no one was safe. Anybody could die. But as to, like, my thoughts on, like, the Fullmetal Alchemist is a shonen anime, and I'm not necessarily saying shonen anime are bad. Dragon Ball Z, One Piece is a shonen anime, and I love that. Fullmetal Alchemist, I do enjoy it immensely, but there are certain things about shonen anime that I don't really like. If you've seen a shonen anime, you know what I'm talking about. Like, you know how, like, they do those weird facial expressions, and they do those weird moments, like, I consider it cheap animation moments in an attempt to be humorous. And I can understand what they go for. They do it to lighten the mood. You don't want to have, like, it be depressing and dark all the time. You want to have something to basically lighten it up. But the thing is, in the case of Fullmetal Alchemist as an anime is meant to be serious. It's like really dark, really, really messed up, just really, really dark. Considering one of the first things you see, or not one of the first things you see, but one of the first major things you see is two boys lose themselves. One loses his entire body, the other one loses an arm and a leg. Yeah. But ultimately, I do like it. I just like the way I see it. Just like like when Granny is telling Armstrong about like what the Elric brothers did to their house. It's a very depressing moment. It's a very sad moment, and it's a really deep emotional moment. It's ultimately ruined, to me, my personal opinion. It's ruined by the fact that Armstrong in the next scene is literally shirtless, and it has this weird flowery pattern around him. He's like, oh, Elric brothers, and like it's funny, but I think it kind of killed the mood. But that's my thoughts on part 1 of Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. What were your thoughts on part 1? Who's your favorite character? Who's your least favorite character? What were your thoughts on Hughes' death? Yeah, that's my thoughts on part 1. And yeah, that was like basically that. I know my thoughts weren't really until the last part, but I just wanted to give an overview of it and basically describe it for those of you who haven't seen it.